Awesome. All right. Thank you all for coming. If you are trying to get
Yeah, I'm
CE
just gonna
credit for this, and please mute yourself too.
Awesome.
All right.
Oh
Thank you all
no,
for
hold
hold
on.
on just a second. All right. That should be better. Okay. We don't have that echo thing happening. So yeah, thank you all for coming. And if you are trying to get CE credit for this, CE credit is only given for watching and participating with the live lecture. The recorded lecture will not get you CE credit at this time, but it may in the future once I set that up. So in order to ensure that you get CE credit for this course, you'll have to fill out the survey, which I will post in the chat near the end. If you don't see that link, you can email me at info@ourhonor.org. And if you have any questions, you can also email me there too, if you're having difficulty getting your certificate. And we would love to keep this free and accessible to all, but it does cost money to make these CEs race approved. So if you are able to donate, please do. And we accept Venmo at Our Honor, or you can go to ourhonor.org/donate. And if you have any questions during the lecture, please post those in the chat and then we'll answer questions afterwards. So Dr. Rachel Mason originally trained as an astronomer, obtaining a PhD in astronomy and then working as a scientist at some of the world's largest observatories. After several years, she began to realize that she was far more concerned about the problems we have on our own planet, particularly in food and agriculture. And in 2016, she went back to school and obtained an MS in sustainable agriculture from the University of Vermont. Her MS thesis focused on how warmer temperatures and heavier rain will change how dairy farming affects the environment. And since then, she has published research into greenhouse gas emissions from cattle production, changes in the global nitrogen cycle, and the use of remote sensing data for conservation and land use planning. Dr. Mason now works as an independent researcher and consultant guided by the question, how can we have good food, happy people and animals, and a healthy environment all at the same time? So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Mason.
All right, thank you very much, Crystal. Okay, there we go. I understand how to change slides now, so that's great. All right, so if you've been paying any attention whatsoever in the last few years, you will have come across this debate about how animal agriculture affects the environment, and specifically how eating beef contributes or does not contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. You might have heard that eating beef is super bad for the climate, but you might also have heard that, well, if we just put all the animals, if we take them out of the feedlots and put them onto pasture, then that's going to fix all these problems. Or maybe that's actually the completely wrong thing to do and we should be doing the absolute opposite. Or maybe the whole thing is just a disaster and we all have to go vegan instead. So clearly this is a complicated and contentious study, and I would like to help us navigate our way through this kind of debate today. So as Dr. Heath said, I left a perfectly good career in astronomy to go and study this kind of issue. So of course I do have strong personal opinions on this subject. And it's impossible to be completely objective in a presentation, but I also have a very strong opinion about living in a society of people who are well informed about issues and able to think through them by themselves. So while I will be concentrating on various negative impacts of animal agriculture, what I want to do here is just really try to explain what these issues are, how they work, what some potential solutions are, and why different people might come to different conclusions about this topic. Oops. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today, once I've got the hang of advancing these slides, is first of all, just what is the scale of animal agriculture in the world? This is a fundamental issue, which I don't think receives very much attention and is essential for understanding these issues. I will talk about the so-called industrial model of animal production, and I will talk about problems associated with animal agriculture in general and with the industrial model in particular. I'll talk about greenhouse gas emissions and water pollution, issues to do with manure. And I will also touch on some sort of social kind of issues, quality of life for people living near industrial animal agriculture, competition between producing food for humans versus feed for animals, issues of wealth, power, and control in the food system. They are less of my research specialty, so I will just touch upon them briefly. I'll also look at potential solutions to all these problems and give 3 different perspectives on how the food system might evolve in the future. And I'll also try to explain why there is no one single answer to this and why people disagree. But first of all, just a very basic question, how many food animals are there in the world? Well, the answer is there's a lot. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization tries to keep track of this. And as of 2012, about 10 years ago, there were more than 20 billion farmed poultry in the world, more than 1 billion cattle, and almost 1 billion pigs. And these numbers are not getting any smaller. So the estimate was that there were in total about 28 billion farmed animals in 2012. And the projection is that this is going to increase to about 40 billion by 2050. A lot of that growth is going to come in low and middle income countries. In Africa alone, the number of farmed land animals is likely to increase by more than a factor of 3 between now and the middle of the century. And at this point, if you look at it by weight at least, most of the land mammals in the world are humans and our livestock and our pets. Only something like 2% of the mammals in the world by weight are now wild animals. The rest of it is us and our animals. So how are these animals raised? How do we go from animal to meat or other animal products? Well, of course, worldwide, there are many, many different animal production systems. There are people raising animals in their backyard, doing subsistence farming. They've got animals on pasture. They're doing pastoral herding. They have mixed crop livestock systems. There's an enormous variety of animal systems. Animals in these systems often have multiple purposes. They produce food, but they also produce traction. They ensure that nutrient cycling happens. They can be used to storing wealth. Maybe you don't have a bank account, but maybe your wealth is stored in these 10 cattle that you own. So there's a wide variety of purposes and uses for animals. But on the whole, the trend is towards larger scale, more intensive, more controlled, and more specialized animal raising models. So you'll be raising animals in a larger system under more control and just for a single purpose, whether that's eggs or meat or milk or something else. And the logical endpoint of this is the so-called industrial system. So industrial agriculture conjures up a lot of different images for people. So I want to get us all on the same page here. And I will be using this term to describe an end-to-end system. So an entire system that encompasses animal and plant breeding, raising crops to feed those animals, keeping animals in a confined area and bringing feed to them, and high throughput slaughter and processing of those animals. As I just mentioned, a key characteristic of this is that animals are confined in a certain area and feed is brought to them. And then the whole system is characterized by standardization, technology, and economies of scale. So in short, it's much like any other kind of modern industry, except that key processes are taking place inside the bodies of animals instead of in machines. And I will be focusing mainly on the US today. I imagine that most of this audience is in the US, and if not, it's relevant to understand this anyway, because this model is now starting to proliferate in other countries as well, especially in low and middle income countries. So understanding this model is valuable for understanding how things are developing elsewhere. And in the US, industrial production really is dominant. It's the dominant way of raising animals. According to certain estimates based on the US Census of Agriculture, now more than 98% of pigs, turkeys, and chickens raised for eggs and meat live in these concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs or AFOs. There is actually a strict technical definition of that word, but for our purposes, we can just think of them as areas where very large numbers of animals are kept and feed is brought to them, like this broiler chicken operation on the right here. It's a bit different for beef cattle. Most of them still start their lives on pasture, but about 97% of them will at some point in their lives pass through a feedlot to be fattened for slaughter. Similarly with milk, most milk is now from dairies that have at least 500 cows, And there are dairies in this country with literally tens of thousands of animals now. On those dairies, the cattle are generally confined to barns or feedlots for most of their lives, most of their productive lives. And I should mention that it's key to note that I say that most milk is from dairies with more than 500 cows. That doesn't necessarily mean that most dairies have more than 500 cows, just that that's where the bulk of the production occurs. And again, this whole thing is happening on a very large scale. There's about 100 million cattle in this country at any one time. And every year we slaughter about 9 billion chickens for meat. So it's really large numbers going on here. And as I said, this is an end-to-end system. So we should just take a look at what this system looks like to understand this industrial supply chain. The whole thing is becoming more and more integrated and standardized and optimized as time goes on. So it's really good to understand this whole thing. So on the left-hand end, we have inputs to these animal raising facilities, CAFOs or CAFOs. Animals are produced to go into their pharmaceuticals, that kind of thing. Other inputs, services, such as veterinary services, they're all being produced and going into the CAFO. We also have to produce feed for these animals. So there's a whole industry that relates to agricultural inputs, machinery, tractors, combine harvesters, seed production, agrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides. They're used in the industrial monocrop farming that produces the large amounts of feed that is needed for these animals. And then on the other side of the CAFO, we have the slaughterhouses, the further processing, the retail outlets, the food service institutions that make up the rest of this system. And one big achievement of this system is that it produces a very large amount of animal products, which are relatively cheap at the point of purchase. And in doing so, in obtaining this achievement, it creates a number of unintended consequences, a number of side effects, things like greenhouse gas emissions, water and air pollution, and other things that we will talk about. But let's start with greenhouse gas emissions. So where do greenhouse gases come from? Why does agriculture produce these? Well, the first thing you need to know is that in agriculture, at least, there are three main greenhouse gases to be aware of. First, there's good old CO2, the greenhouse gas that we've been talking about forever. It's actually relatively weak in terms of its global warming power compared to these other gases, but we put an awful lot of it into the atmosphere. And the thing about CO2 is that it persists in the atmosphere for thousands of years. If we stop emitting now, our CO2 is going to still be hanging around for a long time. There's also methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, much more so than CO2. But it's very short-lived. It remains in the atmosphere for only about 12 years before it gets broken down by chemical processes going on in the atmosphere. We also have nitrous oxide, N2O, which is also a powerful greenhouse gas, and it's fairly long-lived. It lives for over 100 years. And this is maybe a gas that we should be talking about more, but yeah. So when people try to do these inventories, like figure out how much what are the greenhouse gas emissions from this farm or from this production system versus that production system, or globally for the whole global food system, they will sum up all these gases and produce what they call CO2 equivalents. So where are these greenhouse gases emitted? Well, it's all the way along this chain of production that we just looked at. We get greenhouse gas emissions from produced animals when ruminants digest that feed, from storing and using manure, from farm operations, and from the post-farm processing, storage, cooling, that kind of thing of the products that come out. So let's just take a look at each of these steps in the chain. So emissions from feed production. Okay, so if you are doing if you're doing agriculture with machinery, which we generally are, then you're using fossil fuels to power that machinery to produce these feed crops. Using fossil fuels produces CO2. If you're using fertilizer, then the process that we use to manufacture fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process, that creates nitrous oxide emissions. It also uses energy. And when you apply fertilizer to fields, then microbial processes turn it into nitrous oxide as well. If you need land to grow this feed or to put your cows out on pasture, your animals on pasture, then if you clear forests to do that, then the carbon that used to be stored in those forests will be released back into the atmosphere. So that's a source of CO2. And if you burn the forest, then that will release nitrous oxide as well. clearing forests for pasture or feed crops is not such a big factor in US agriculture because we have so much land here and we grow so much food and use so much pasture ourselves. But it does happen. You'll have heard about deforestation in the Amazon to make pasture for beef and to grow soybeans. Some of those soybeans will be exported to Europe to feed cattle over there. So that can be a factor in certain circumstances. Overall, because industrial production relies on mechanization, then it tends to have higher energy related emissions compared to pastured production. So we've grown for the animals, now the animals eat the food. And if we're talking about ruminants anyway, then you'll know more about this than I do, but microbes in the rumen of those animals are going to convert that plant material into CO2 and hydrogen, and from then into methane. So that's where the whole cow burp story is coming from. Animals that are grazing usually emit more methane than animals that are fed on grain and concentrates. So the amount of methane that's produced really depends on the diet of the animal. So grazing systems are at a disadvantage when it comes to the methane emissions inventories. Okay, we've fed the animals, they've digested the food, and now it comes to the other end of the animal. When we store manure as a liquid, then microbial processes generate methane from the liquid manure. If we take that manure and apply it to soil, then again, microbial processes convert some of them into some of that nitrogen into nitrous oxide. Ammonia in urine also gets converted to nitrous oxide. And this diagram on the left is, it's not meant to scare you, but it kind of is, because the whole point is that these are really complicated microbial processes, environmental conditions and other factors. So when people try to do these emission inventories, you know, what's emitted from this farm, this production system for the entire world, this is an area where things can get really uncertain. And then finally, we have emissions from farm operations and from farm infrastructure. We use fossil fuels to operate machinery, transport products, store products, cool products. That all generates CO2. And actually just building the buildings that we use, that results in CO2 emissions as well. Concrete is actually a really big source of CO2 emissions. So again, when you do these inventories, when you build these life cycle analyses, you might want to take into account the energy that was used to build the buildings, depending on the purpose of this analysis. So yeah, there's greenhouse gas emissions all the way along the chain here. And especially when you're raising ruminants, you have that extra step of the enteric fermentation that produces methane. But you may also have heard that cattle can help to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's this process of soil carbon sequestration. This is really contentious and debated. So what's actually going on here? So the point is that when plants grow, they take CO2 from the atmosphere and they turn that into plant biomass. They turn that into their own structure. That's photosynthesis. And when those plants die, if they decay, then that biomass returns to the atmosphere as CO2. The carbon goes back into the atmosphere. And that's fine because, you know, with a short-lived plant like black grasses, they're just constantly taking in CO2 from the atmosphere. They decay, they return it to the atmosphere. That's fine. That's just a short-term carbon cycle. That has no net effect on atmospheric CO2. One really cool thing that can happen, though, is that when plant material dies, under the right circumstances, some of that carbon can get into the soil organic matter pool instead of being returned to the atmosphere. Soil organic matter is really complicated, but there are certain fractions of it that can resist decay for a really long time. So if you can get the plant material into the soil and make it become that kind of soil organic matter that resists decay, then you've drawn down CO2 from the atmosphere and you've locked it up in the soil. So you've drawn down carbon. And that's this whole idea behind soil carbon sequestration. And it is proposed that grazing can help doing that. Some plants, when they are grazed, that will encourage them to grow more biomass. And if there's more biomass, then maybe more of it will go into the soil and be stored there. And things like grazing and trampling can also encourage the growth of plant roots. And of course, it's easier for carbon from the roots of a plant to get into the soil organic matter and stay there. So the argument goes that by doing grazing really well, you can draw down CO2 from the atmosphere and store it long-term in the soil. And like I said, this is really debated and contentious, but the way I think about this is that, yes, that can happen. That that can be a thing that happens, but only sometimes, and it only lasts for a while. So there's a few things to think about here. And one thing is that if grazing is going to be a net carbon sink, then the CO2 that you draw down from the atmosphere, the amount of that has to offset all of the other emissions from the feed, from the manure, from everything else. And whether that happens is going to depend on lots of different factors, like what's the current state of the soil, how much organic matter is in there, what's the climate like, kind of vegetation is here, and how are you managing those animals and that pasture. The process can't go on forever. You can't just keep pumping CO2 into the soil forever. The carbon pool is eventually going to reach some kind of equilibrium, maybe on the timescale of decades. And it's potentially reversible. Good management can draw down carbon, poor management can let it all back out into the atmosphere. So you're depending on good management for a long time. So my interpretation of this is that, yeah, absolutely, grazing can be part of the climate solution, but I really don't think it's the panacea that some people seem to suggest that it is. So putting this all together, these pie charts are for cattle, and they are for the entire world, not just the US. But you will see that enteric fermentation, the blue piece, the big blue piece in the pie charts, the left one is milk, the right one is meat. This is huge. It's almost half of the emissions from making meat and cow milk. Sorry, making milk and cow meat. Manure and fertilizer, these green portions, they're also really big. And at least for beef, clearing forest for new grazing land and new feed production areas is significant for beef. Overall, livestock supply chains contribute about almost 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Cattle meat is about 40% of that, and milk is about 20%. So these numbers are going to be a bit different from the US, and they're going to be very different for monogastric animals, pigs and chickens and what have you. So I mentioned that the amount of methane that you get from an animal depends on what that animal is eating, among some other factors. And cattle in the US are more likely to be fed grain and concentrates than they are to be grazing, compared to, say, a cow in someone's homestead in Kenya. So this blue piece is going to be somewhat smaller for the US. And then, of course, for monogastric systems, it's going to be smaller or probably negligible. So what does that mean then? Does that mean we just switch to pigs and chickens and everything's fine? Well, actually not so fast. So I just mentioned that manure management and storage also produces greenhouse gases. So that's still a thing. And yeah, one thing to know is that industrial animal agriculture concentrates a lot of manure in one place. It's been estimated that a large pig operation will produce about as much excrement as a medium-sized city. So there's an awful lot of manure to deal with, and that manure can cause problems. So you might be thinking, but manure is a great fertilizer, right? So why isn't that just the answer? And you're kind of right. It's just really important that manure is used in the right place, at the right time, in the right amount. And the problem is that a CAFO can just produce too much manure for nearby crops to absorb. If you take the manure from that manure pit and you spray it on crops around that facility, there's just going to be too much of it there. In principle, you could put it on a truck and take it somewhere else to be used where crops need it. But in practice, that's just not financially viable. It costs too much. So what tends to happen is that manure is used around the CAFO, but it can be used in amounts that are too much for the crops to absorb. And the nitrogen and phosphorus that is not taken up by the crops can enter ground and surface waters. So that nitrogen can leach down into groundwater where it can contaminate drinking water. Nitrogen and phosphorus particularly can be eroded off fields. When erosion happens, nitrogen and phosphorus can be bound to those soil particles, and that can end up in surface waters. And surface runoff, rain just washing this stuff off the surface, can transport it into surface waters as well. And when that happens, nutrients are good, but you can have too much of a good thing. So when you get excess nitrogen and phosphorus from manure into water, you end up with things like harmful algal blooms. This contributes to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. With an acute event, you can have a big fish kill. So yeah, a lot of problems can end up happening. Oops. What's going on here? Oh, okay. Well, that's a shame. But anyway, I'll just have to explain what was in that picture. So in principle, what you can do with all this manure is you can calculate how much you're going to produce, and you can calculate how much nitrogen and how much phosphorus that's going to contain. You can look at the kind of crops that you want to grow and how much land you have. And you can create this detailed management plan, a nutrient management plan that says what you're supposed to do with this manure to stop having these environmental problems. And that is actually what is mandated in many states for certain kinds of CAFOs. So that is intended to prevent these problems, but it's not always that effective. And what I wanted to show you on this slide was satellite images that show spreading of manure onto snow in Wisconsin over the winter. So you would see some snowy fields on the left, and then on the right, you would see snowy fields, but with dark stripes of manure over them that were found in satellite data. The farmer had spread manure onto snow, which is a very bad thing to do. It's really not allowed because there are no plants there to take this up. If rain happens on top of that snow, or when the snow melts, all of that manure is just right there waiting to be washed into nearby creeks and that kind of thing. And that will cause issues with nitrogen and phosphorus. And manure also contains pathogens, heavy metals, various kinds of things that you really don't want in the water. So we have ways of dealing with these. They're not always totally effective. Why would that farmer do a thing like that? Well, when the manure pit's full, the manure pit has to be emptied. And how that happened? Well, I don't know in the specific case of this farm, but there's an underlying problem with concentrating so many animals in one place and separating crops and livestock. So if you think about this, let's say we're in the Midwest and we're growing corn and soybeans to use as animal feed somewhere else. So we're bringing in fertilizer, we're adding nitrogen and phosphorus to our corn fields and to our soybean fields as well. And then we take the corn and soybean, we take that nitrogen and phosphorus that they contain, and we take it somewhere else. Let's say we take it to a hog farm in North Carolina. So we feed that nitrogen and phosphorus and other stuff to the animals, and they retain some of it in their bodies. And then we export that as animal products and humans eat it. So it gets taken out of the system. But some of it, they excrete it in their manure and their urine, and it has to go somewhere. And many CAFOs do grow some level of crops around them, but we're just constantly importing nutrients there. And there's only so much that the land and the crops can handle. So even in Vermont, which you don't really think of as a hotbed of industrial animal agriculture, even there, it's been calculated that the amount of nutrients that's been imported to the state in actually animal feed and bedding over the last few decades exceeds what has been exported in milk and what has been taken up by crops. And what's happened there is just over the decades, more and more and more phosphorus has built up in the soil in Vermont. And now it's washing off into rivers and streams, and it's creating water quality problems, algal blooms in places like Lake Champlain. I'm picking on Vermont because I just know that's a place where that calculation has been done, where the data were available. But I would be very surprised if it's not also the case for a state like Georgia or North Carolina with their massive amounts of animal production as well. Okay, so that was issues that we have to deal with manure under business as usual, but sometimes things happen, manure happens, so to speak. So if you have manure stored in liquid manure lagoons, like you do for pig farms especially, then if there's heavy rain on those lagoons, then there's a danger that they will overflow. And that has happened. That's happened in numerous cases. So in North Carolina, for example, when Hurricane Florence happened in 2018, a number of these manure lagoons overflowed, like you can see in this picture. There's an organization called Waterkeeper Alliance that keeps tabs on this kind of thing. And if you're interested, there's been some very good reporting in the media as well. And moving on to more kind of social issues, there are impacts from industrial animal agriculture. Oh, before I move on to that, I did want to mention that you can have manure management issues on any size or kind of farm that has animals. I do want to be clear about that. It's not just industrial facilities, just that whole scale and separation of crops and livestock brings another layer of difficulty to the problem. So with that out of the way, returning to social issues, people who live around CAFOs often report that it's not a nice experience. And that burden disproportionately falls on low-income communities and people of colour. So just to quote one example, in this interview, people talked about just general disruptions to their quality of life, noise from tractor trailers moving feed and animals at all times of day and night. And maybe most strikingly, they said the smell from the farms is like a decomposing body or rotting eggs. And when this happens, they feel that they can't leave their houses. It's a quality of life issue. And beyond quality of life, literature reviews have found health problems associated with CAFOs as well. This one found that respiratory outcomes, MRSA, Q fever, and stress and mood disorders were consistently and positively associated with living near a CAFO. Speaking of MRSA, I was going to talk about antibiotic resistance. That is a big problem worldwide, especially in developing countries where a lot of antibiotics are used on animals, and this procedure is not well regulated. The regulations have changed in the US in the last few years, and I have to admit that I'm not super well informed about what effect that has had on outcomes to do with antibiotic resistance. So I'm not going to go into that now, but we could talk about it in the discussion if you are interested. Okay, so next issue. There is competition in using land and resources to produce food for humans, feed for animals, inputs for biofuels, and all the other things that we use land and agricultural resources for. Globally, livestock consume about a third of the global cereal production. And you can certainly argue that using resources to produce crops to feed animals that are then turned into human food is a very inefficient way of doing things. Now, this is a really contentious subject, and there's lots of trade-offs that occur and a lot of research that still needs doing. So you might think about, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't be growing corn to feed cattle. Maybe we should be using that land to grow something for humans to eat. But then maybe actually using grassland to feed cattle is a good use of resources, but maybe it's not. Maybe that grassland should be turned back into forest for wild animals to live in. So there's an awful lot of trade-offs and value judgments involved there. I just wanted to flag that this is something that people really are thinking about, and maybe you should have it in the back of your mind when you're thinking about animal agriculture. Finally, I want to talk about wealth, power, and control in the food system. So here's the supply chain diagram that we looked at earlier, and the color coding means something. So the dark squares show places in the system where operations are mostly carried out by just a few large companies. And in the light boxes, they show parts of the system where we have many, many farmers still involved and many, many consumers. So what this means is that, for example, if a farmer wants to go and buy inputs to grow crops, seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, in the past, they might have been able to deal with a range of independent dealers. You'd have a lot of farmers dealing with a lot of input providers, whereas now they might just have 3 or 4 companies to choose from. And these companies, they've been integrating, they've been merging, they've been getting bigger, taking up a larger and larger share of the market over many years. What has also been happening is that the various different stages along this supply chain have been getting more and more integrated and often controlled by a certain company will control various stages in this process. That's known as vertical integration. To give a picture of how that might work, or to give an example, in the US, pretty much all pigs and chickens are now raised under contract by a lot of growers for just a handful of companies. So how this works is that the company will provide you with inputs. They'll provide you with like baby chicks. They'll provide you with the feed for the chicks and any other inputs, pharmaceutical type things that those animals need. And then you provide the infrastructure. You build the big barn. You take on the debt for that. And then you grow those animals until they're ready for slaughter. And then the company comes back, you give those chicks to the company, you get paid, and they handle the slaughtering and the processing and so on. There are some good things about this system. It can be very efficient. And if you're a grower, you don't have to worry about market prices at the end of this. You have a guaranteed buyer for the chicks that you raise or the pigs that you raise. On the other hand, it does mean that farmers have less choice about how they farm and a lot less power in this process. If you want to do something different, if you want to raise animals outdoors, for example, then you're not going to get a contract with one of these integrators. And if you don't like how that integrator is treating you, if they give you what you think are substandard chickens, so you don't get paid a good price when they don't grow to a good size, then you could look for someone else to do business with, but maybe in your area there's only 1 or 2 integrators, so you just don't have a lot of choice in what to do. So it is argued that this is removing power and control from farmers, and people will say that companies now have a lot of power and influence over individual growers, also in politics, and arguably over the whole global food system in its entirety, given that these companies are often large transnational agribusinesses. And people in academia will argue that this is kind of a dangerous situation. So plenty of problems there, environmental problems, social problems, and I really just scratched the surface. In the time available, I can't give you a comprehensive and in-depth picture of everything that can go wrong and why, but hopefully that's just a taster of the scope and breadth of unintended consequences of raising animals for feed. But maybe we can fix some of these problems. How can we do that? Well, I'm going to describe 3 different options that we could use, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but just 3 broad pathways that we could take in the future. So first of all, we could use technology and efficiency and control. We could kind of double down on the industrial system, try and fix some of its problems. Or secondly, maybe we just need to restrain ourselves. Maybe we don't need all this meat. Maybe we should just eat less of it, eat something else instead. Or finally, maybe the whole thing is just rotten to the core and we need to transform the entire food system. So I'll go into each of these options in a bit more depth, and then I will explain why it's kind of difficult to agree on what we should do. So first of all, doubling down on the industrial option, well, we can use technology to make progress on some of these problems. Enteric methane, well, we can reduce that, changing what we feed cows and feeding them supplements like seaweed. We could capture some of that methane and use it as fuel, use it as biogas. So nutrients, we could look at, well, what are the most economically efficient penalties and incentives for CAFOs to improve their manure management? I mean, there are things that they could do better. We just need to figure out how to get farmers to do that and how to make it financially viable. And then we can do things like change so that we can feed them phytates so that they will excrete phosphorus, for example, and that will help with our manure problems. Food feed competition. Well, what we need to do is use high-tech precision agriculture to use resources as efficiently as possible, produce as much food as we can with as little land and fertilizer as possible. So that's one way that this could go. But maybe that's not going to work. Maybe what we need to do is just eat less meat or no at all and forgo animal products entirely. We could get protein and other nutrients from plant-based whole foods, things like legumes. We could use plant-based meat analogues. We could eat cultured meat, meat that's grown in a lab. That's the second option. Or maybe we just need to forget this whole industrial nonsense once and for all. Meat is not the central question. Maybe what we need to do is, well, there's many different visions for this, but maybe we need to reintegrate crops and livestock. Maybe we need to do organic farming, agroecological farming, indigenous, veganic agriculture. Maybe we need to strengthen local economies and support local farmers by doing farm to table, farm to school, farm to institution. And maybe what we're aiming for is thriving local and regional food systems where local people have more control over how agriculture is done. Maybe it's stronger labor rights, higher wages, or just good old economic justice. These kind of visions really, what's underlying them is just a fundamentally different vision of how we relate to animals and to communities, to people, and to the environment underneath. So what should we do? What's the right thing to do? Well, partly, this is just a really difficult empirical scientific question that has an awful lot of moving parts. And I want to just give an example of why this is a difficult scientific question. And part of it is that you can just get really weird counterintuitive results the more you look at the system. There's this one modeling study that illustrates this really well. So what these scientists did was they did some calculations using various assumptions, and they found that if you add more maize and concentrate to the diets of dairy cows in the UK, then those cows will produce more milk and you will need fewer cows. So you'll need fewer cows, you'll get more milk per unit cow, And that means that overall, the greenhouse gas emissions from dairy production in the UK will decrease. So that's cool. But then they thought about, well, where would this maize and concentrates come from? Well, you would have to produce them somewhere, and you'd have to use fertilizer and machinery and that kind of thing. So if you need more maize and concentrates for these cows, then emissions from feed production are going to increase. And then they thought about it a bit more, and they were like, well, if we don't have as many cows, but we're producing the same amount of milk, that means that these cows aren't giving birth as much. And dairy cows, the male ones, are used for meat. People still want to eat beef, but if they can't eat the dairy cow babies, then they're going to want to get beef from somewhere, and they're probably going to get it from Brazil. And if there's more demand for beef in Brazil, that means there's going to be more deforestation there. So overall, when they put all these factors together, they found that, yeah, you can make milk production more efficient in the UK, but that just meant that globally, greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of milk actually went up. So there's these really weird and counterintuitive results, and it all depends on which parts of the system you decide to even think about to start with. So they found that emissions per kilogram of milk increased, but I'm sure there are ways that you could make it decrease as well. But that in itself is not necessarily a good thing, because even if you're more efficient, if you have lower emissions per every kilogram of meat or milk, you might produce more kilograms of meat or milk, so your total emissions could still go up. And there's a couple of ways that this might happen. So if you have cattle that are more productive, maybe you have a higher supply and then prices go down, but then there's more demand. So then more people start to produce more meat or milk, so production actually goes up. Or maybe a government says, yeah, reducing emissions is a good thing. We want to subsidize farmers who do that. And maybe that makes farms more profitable. And maybe that makes them think, hey, I can make money doing this. So they expand their operations and they produce more. So this guy on the right, William Stamp, I can't actually see his name there. William Stanley Jevons, I think it is. Yeah, he's an economist from the UK in, I think, the 19th century who thought through these issues. And this is known as Jevons paradox, named after him, where if we do something more efficiently, then we tend to do more of it. And whether this really happens in practice is highly debated. There's a load of researchers, economists trying to figure out if this is a thing that really happens. But this is just another reason about why this is a really complicated question. So it's a complicated empirical scientific question, but really it's also complicated because when we talk about meat, when we talk about animal production, we're always talking about values and issues that lie behind this as well. We're thinking about, well, what's good for rural communities? What's good for workers? What's good for animals? Who should be in control of the food supply? Who should have power and influence over how we can do agriculture? What problems do we believe that science and technology and markets can fix? Do we think that governments should intervene, or do we think that they should keep out? Do humans have the right to consume as much as we want to? Or do we need to restrain ourselves? So we're always talking about these much deeper underlying issues in these circumstances. So I'm going to bring this back to these three food futures and kind of explain them, just to explain the kind of thinking that might be behind each one of them. And I'm just going to try and move this little thing. Okay, just fiddling with Zoom so I can see all of my slides. Okay. So, okay, future of food, option one, kind of double down on industrialization. Maybe in this case, you're thinking the world's population is growing and people want to eat meat. Industrial animal production is the only way to provide this affordable protein that people demand and deserve. This kind of animal production is more efficient and productive than anything else we've ever come up with. I mean, yeah, it has some problems, but we've got technology, we've got markets, we can fix them. So that's what we should do. On the other hand, maybe you think, well, yeah, industrial animal production might be efficient in a very narrow sense of the world, but it just keeps on growing and growing. And there's no way we continue like this. Meat production on this scale just is too many resources and it has too much impact on the environment. We just need to eat less animal-based meats, and we need to get our protein from plants or from lab-grown meat instead. And that goes double for those of us in the rich world. If we eat less, then people in low-income countries that really need those nutrients can eat the meat that they need without everybody ruining everything. So maybe that's the way forward. Or maybe you think we need to just throw that whole thing out and start again. The food system serves nobody but corporations and shareholders. People and animals are just nothing but cogs in the machine. And we're ruining the life support systems, the earth systems that keep us alive. And why are we doing this? So we can have chicken McNuggets. We know how to produce abundant, healthy food in ways that are good for people and our planet. Now, why don't you just get out of our way and let us get on with it? So those are the 3 options you might be thinking about. There is a 4th option as well, which is to eat absolutely nothing at all. And I'm suggesting this because I should tell you that I took the title of this talk from this book, which is about the science of food fraud, detecting food that's not really what it's supposed to be. This book talks about the Chinese baby milk scandal. It talks about those burgers in the UK that turned out to be made of horses. And it talks about eggs that are painted with oranges painted with toxic orange paint to make them look ripe when they're not really. And it even talks about fake eggs, like actual fake, convincing fake eggs that are not eggs, but people ate them anyway. So yeah, based on this book, option 4 is to just don't eat anything at all. So I'm going to stop there so that we have plenty of time for questions. I know that was a lot of material covered quite fast. So thank you for your time and attention, and let's take it from there.
Thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I'm just going to scroll through right now. And yeah, the New York Times today was talking about the COP28 meeting. That's a major focus. Do you have any comments about that?
Oh, that is a very broad question.
Not really a
Yes,
question. I was just, bringing it up since it was a topic of discussion in the chat.
Right. Yeah, I don't really know what to say about that. I haven't been following this COP process too closely, although am I right in thinking that they have reduced the amount of meat they're serving at the meeting? If I'm correct about that, then that seems like a good step forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And I'm sure we're all just kind of waiting for what the results of that meeting will be. And I haven't read all the articles yet, but there's plenty of articles in the chat for everybody to get caught up on. And so that's just kind of that. And then I was just asking that, I've read that only 1% of the world's protein comes from animals who are grazed exclusively. But these non-native grazers also spread some highly flammable grasses like cheatgrass and red brome that increase chances of fires. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh yeah, that's another really interesting point. I'm talking to you from Hawaii. I'm on the Big Island, but obviously we have the events on Maui in August very much in our minds. And there, yes, non-native grasses have proliferated and contributed to the spread of that fire. And on our island, we have vast expanses of them as well. And it's interesting that grazing here is being promoted as a potential solution. I think it can only be a partial solution. There's so much going on here. So yeah, it's a super complicated subject. Mm-hmm. And what did I want to say about that? Yeah, so the complicated thing here is if you look at the state of the ecosystem as it is now, here on the Big Island, we look at the non-native fire-prone grasses and we think we need to get rid of them so we can use animals to remove some of that biomass. And I think that may be somewhat effective, if not a total solution. But then thinking back to, well, why is this not native dry forest anymore? Why do we have non-native fire-prone grasses? And that probably is to do with cattle production here. We actually have some of the largest private ranches in the US on this island. So removing the dry forest and replacing it with grasses was probably done to produce cattle feed in the first place. So yeah, it's super interesting that now grazing might be part of the solution. In other places, you might want to avoid doing it because you might just be creating more problems by changing how that ecosystem works in the first place. So yes, I don't know if that got to the listener's question, but that's how I'm seeing things right here at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely an area worth talking about some more, since we're just kind of taught, oh, grazing is the solution, but really there's a lot more to it. So yeah, thank you for that. And then Heidi asked, could you comment on cogeneration systems in CAFOs where they capture and concentrate the manure to produce natural gas, which is then used for energy? And I know here in California, a lot of the dairy producers end up making more money off of selling these low carbon fuel standard credits than they do by even selling milk. So yeah, please comment on that.
Yeah, that is just nuts. It reminds me of this whole thing about I don't know if anybody's watched the documentary King Corn, where some filmmakers grew an acre of corn and realized that in the end they only broke even because of the government subsidies that they captured. So yeah, I am just generally not a fan of industrial dairy production. I think it causes more problems than it solves and produces products that we just don't need in such massive quantities. The whole story of the dairy industry has been massive overproduction, falling prices, and people going out of business. So, I mean, on a surface level, sure, if natural gas is being created, or methane from manure is being created, and it's a problem, then sure, we should do something about that. But I tend to prefer system level solutions that actually look at the root of the problem rather than just saying, hey, let's pay farmers for methane.
Yeah, and I forget what it is. Isn't it only 10? How much methane comes from manure? It's like 10%, and like 90% is eructation. And you're like, okay, you're paying these dairy farmers all of this money, more than they make from milk, to capture only 10% of the methane that they produce. So yeah, it's kind of
it's how do you look at the system? You look at, well, dairy farming is very efficient. We take in so little feed and produce so much milk, and we can feed these cows precision diets, which totally minimizes the emissions that they give off. And for methane from manure, well, we can capture it and use it as fuel. That's one way of looking at it, but another is, why are we causing so many other problems to produce so much of a product that just this overproduction is tremendously problematic in the first place?
Yeah, and we don't even have markets for it. And so the dairy industry and government has had to create these markets to sell this, like by forcing it upon school children, and by storing massive quantities in underground caves, and like whole government cheese thing. So yeah, I mean,
it sounds like you've listened to that.
Sorry, what was
it
that?
Sounds like you've listened to that. There's a wonderful podcast episode. I think it's 99% Invisible, about the government cheese mountain. Definitely worth a listen.
I have not. I love 99% Invisible, and I can't believe I missed the episode on government cheese. I have to check that one out. I just met Mariella Williamson, who is the kid, the high schooler who was trying to just promote plant-based milk in her school.
Yeah.
They came down hard on her because I guess according to USDA, you can't promote alternatives to milk without also promoting milk, which kind of seems like a First Amendment issue. And so she was suing, and I forget how that's going, but yeah, pretty outrageous stuff. I will move on. The whole dairy industry is shocking. And I think, there's this trend where wealthier countries tend to consume more meat and animal products, and wealthier people. But really, is that just a byproduct of capitalism? I wonder, because these animal agriculture industries are very powerful. So they create markets. It's not that people are choosing this, but they are making it so accessible, so socially acceptable, so frowned upon to not choose their products, and it's ubiquitous and cheap. And we use the government to make it that way. So I just wonder how much of it is actual personal choice versus these industries making these fake markets for their products in these wealthier countries.
We're asking very deep questions here. Yeah, so I'm just reading a book called Big Chicken at the moment. So it's the story of the chicken industry, and it actually focuses a lot on antibiotic use. Um, so yeah, back in I think it was the late 40s, there's a wonderful example of this. So people had accidentally figured out that using antibiotics on chickens made them grow really fast. And this, to do with various stuff about markets for meat during the war and everything, meant that the chicken industry just expanded hugely. But then, of course, as usually happens, you expand really fast, you produce so much, demand doesn't go up as fast, and prices just crater. And then you have all these people in government thinking, what are we going to do to help the chicken farmers? And it wasn't clear what to do. One obvious answer is, well, limit production, but they weren't keen on that. So it was all a bit of a mess until someone invented the chicken nugget. And this turned out to be super popular because suddenly you don't have this big chicken that you have to deal with at the end of the day. You've got these frozen chicken nuggets that you can just go and, I don't know, however you cook chicken nuggets. And demand just exploded after that. So I think there is something to intrinsic desire for meat and demand for meat. But at the same time, yeah, there's definitely these industry forces working to try and manufacture demand, as you put it.
Yeah, I mean, we used to eat 50 something pounds of meat in 1960, and now it's like 240 pounds in our country today. And Heidi also asks, and we've kind of discussed this a little bit, but if you want to say anything further about this, could you comment on the possible role of alternative proteins, including cell-based meat, as a solution or part of one?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that cell-based meat in particular will become a big part of the solution. I think it seems to be facing some not necessarily technical challenges. I think we know how to do it. It's can we scale it, and can we make it economical? Can it compete on price? I think Italy just banned it, so there are definitely going to be some efforts at pushback from various people, meat industry and beyond. But honestly, thinking about things like pet food, like why would you bother raising animals to feed to a cat or dog? The cat or dog is not going to care whether that meat came from a lab. So that seems like an obvious use case if we can get the price down enough. I'm sure people will be thinking, oh, but the pets eat the byproducts of the animals that would have been slaughtered anyway, which I've seen a recent study saying that's not true, just as an aside. But yeah, I'm really hopeful that cell-based meat will be part of the solution, that we can do it sustainably, that these projections about its water use, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions being really low do turn out to be true. And yeah, I really hope we can get there soon.
Yeah, I mean, we've spent so much money on research on decreasing the emissions and the impact of producing meat from animals. If we put that same amount of energy, I think, into researching how to reduce the impact of cell meat, I think, we would have the same result of, decreasing the emissions impact of cell-based meat the same way we have done with animal agriculture. And yeah, it's so shocking that Italy banned cell-based meat. And there's this whole myth too going around that it causes cancer. And I think consumers might be worried, oh my gosh, if I feed my dog or cat cell-based meat, are they going to get cancer? And I think that there's this whole agenda by the slaughter-based meat industry to really limit our choice to consume these products by making us afraid of it, by banning it in certain countries so that we don't really have an option for to choose how we would want to consume. So yeah, that's interesting. And moving on, seems like this is such a multidisciplinary global effort. How can we prioritize animal welfare in the effort?
You're asking me the hardest questions ever. I was hoping for like technical greenhouse gas emission questions or something. Yeah, we have to work together. I'm thinking at the moment, I'm writing about the drivers of factory farming and how they link to efforts in the animal advocacy community to make something different or better happen. And I think a lot of it is going to come down to collaboration between people in different disciplines and with different interests, the environmental community and the animal advocacy community. And I keep being struck when I'm reading research about sustainability that animal welfare often seems like it's either not mentioned at all or it's mentioned in passing, but it's not focused on. Like, people will talk about the need for dietary change to reduce environmental impacts. And they might mention, oh, and it's bad for animal welfare as well. But it's just mentioned in passing. Like, we can't talk about this because it's an embarrassing thing to be concerned about. It's not a legitimate thing to write about in a scientific paper. And I'm really not sure how we get past that, but I am thinking about it. So I'm sorry, that's a complete non-answer to your question, but yeah, that's really hard.
Yeah, I know. And we have a lot of people welfare scientists on this call right now who are trying to increase the legitimacy of that field. But yeah, it's kind of this basic thing. I just remember in veterinary school, the idea that you care about the welfare of your patients is viewed as so immature and so not professional. And it's like, be a little bit hard and like face the facts. And I just had this memory of in veterinary school of being on this rotation and this horse they were training to tie, and they tied this horse to a pole and let the horse like pull back and got all bloody and everything. And I was really shocked and concerned by this. And we have a behavior department at UC Davis, and I'm like, oh, I think we should send this horse, have the behavior team come and assess this horse. And everybody, rolled their eyes at me like I just, it was too soft or something. And I think we have to get past, like, it's kind of, we're taught as children, if you're from kids whose parents hunt, like, oh, once you start killing animals and hunting, that's a sign of maturity and growth. I could go off on this topic. But yeah, it's just interesting how we dismiss any sort of caring and compassion about animals is very just unimportant and immature almost. And let's see, I'll just go on. Heidi says, it's a way to claim dairy can be sustainable or even beneficial. My research showed that people will be more likely to believe dairies are humane if they are perceived as sustainable, a halo effect. Any comments on that?
Yes, I've seen a little bit of that research. It's like if an industry does a good thing in one area, then we tend to perceive it as just being good all around. And I did think about, like, these issues are complicated and they're systemic and they require a lot of time and effort to understand. And there are people who want you to not understand them. Yeah, we need to. Yeah, there's whole levels of where you can intervene in a system, and this very basic level of the narratives that we tell ourselves about animals and the way we relate to animals and each other and the environment. It just seems like a long, slow change process there. Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, I'm sure this audience is very knowledgeable about that kind of thing. And yeah, I would love to have more conversations with people one-on-one if they're interested in talking.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And yeah, what do you think the greenhouse gas effects of lab-based meat will be? Really tough to answer right now, but when you don't have these trophic levels of production, I think the chances that it'll be a lot smaller than slaughter-based meats is good. What do you think?
The initial life cycle analyses said that, the ones that I read a few years ago. I think they've become a bit more pessimistic recently, but in terms of land use, freshwater use, and greenhouse gas emissions, the lab-grown meat should have a much lower impact. I think there's some uncertainty. I think that the uncertainty is mainly about how the processes are going to scale, because they're mostly being done on a relatively small scale at the moment. It's like, what's going to change as they get much larger in scale? And it's also going to depend on, are people putting pressure on this to be sustainable, or is it mostly just going to be a case of how much money can we make out of it?
Yeah. And so much so many millions, maybe even billions of dollars have gone into like reducing the greenhouse gas effects of slaughter-based protein. I just think, if we put that same energy into increasing the sustainability of these, like, it'll be possible. And there's always beans too. I love the beans is how campaign. I don't know if you've seen that, but the goal is to increase global bean consumption by 50% by some date, which is such a great thing. And putting more beans on menus and making bean dishes more accessible. It's such a great program.
Oh, beans are awesome. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see. And the natural food folks are pushing back against lab-grown cell culture meat, as though a lot of the meat people consume is natural, which is far from true. Any comment
Oh,
on
that's just a pet thing of mine. People saying it's not natural. Well, that chicken that you just ate, was there anything natural about how that animal was produced and raised and turned into meat? But anyway, so yeah, I have seen that pushback. It's not just the plant-based people, it's also the people who are just generally against the cultured meat and the plant-based analogs, just saying, oh, but this is ultra processed. So I guess it's being processed in a factory instead of in the body of an animal. But
yeah.
yeah, so there's someone called Jenny Chapman, a researcher who is looking into this in some depth, like perceptions of processing and how they relate to plant-based meats and cultured meat. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that report, and I can send it to you and distribute it when she publishes it.
Yeah, I would love to see that too. Yeah, it's like people always say lions eat meat, but lions don't like pack animals into factory farms and give them vaccines and antibiotics and feed additives and then genetically select them and chop off their tails and castrate them and debeak them and dehorn them and all of the things that we do. So it's
exactly.
cool. There's also a partially a distrust of corporate control of food in general, which is legitimate corporate capitalism, which has created a lot of damage, like for sure. But any comments on just that whole aspect of it?
Well, that goes back to these food futures. I mean, you could say, let's just preserve the industrial corporate dominated system exactly what it is and just replace the animals with various kinds of plants or with the lab grown meat. So you could do it that way, or you could have, I don't know, I read some papers which are probably totally unrealistic about backyard fermenters, where you can take a sample of your favorite animal and just brew your own meat in the backyard. Maybe that's how it works. I'm not totally convinced that that will happen, but it's a possibility. So yeah, this is such a multifaceted problem, and the solutions could go in so many directions.
Yeah, if we had the technology to produce our own food in our small little apartments, that would be phenomenal. Some of these like fermented precision fermentation programs and stuff like that, if they could be put into people's homes or something, if we had that technology. It's really interesting. Heidi, I'm not sure what you were saying, but I was referring to cogeneration in CAFOs.
Crystal, I was just with the whole thing because it was off when the halo effect, because that's part of the problem, is that there's people there now. These dairies, as you know, are starting to claim, oh, but we're part of the solution. See how we're so sustainable. And so that was part of the foundation for my research when I did this in my PhD, and saw that indeed, if they're if they have this reputation for being sustainable, even if they're very, very clean, right, that people think, oh, they treat their animals well, and that will lead them to eat more of those products. Because it's actually how they perceive the animals are being treated that has the big effect. But on the other hand, it's a much stronger effect if they believe that they're treating the animals poorly, than if they're treating the environment poorly. So it's people are complicated.
I don't know, any further comments on that, Dr. Mason?
No, just what Heidi is saying is, yeah, it's interesting and it makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, just some last comments. Worker co-op owned companies can fill the scale need. Yeah, sure. That would be much better than the current large multinational billion-dollar corporations that we have. And Dr. Hodges says, I attended a webinar on cultured, oops, where did it go? On cultured meats given by UC Davis food folks. Their research is concentrated in their fermentation area, wine, beer, etc. And when I told them I was UC Davis veterinarian alum and asked about the welfare of the animals who would be cell sources, some of the panel members snickered and never answered my question. Like, that's freaking classic and so disrespectful. And Dr. Mason, I will be on a call with Jenny Chapman on Tuesday, part of our recap research group. Oh, awesome.
Oh, perfect.
And the natural food folks are pushing back against, yeah, I think we discussed that. This has just been fascinating and horrifying, but we need to explore it. And that's all the questions and comments.
Can I just ask, was a question about nitrous oxide versus CO2 versus methane addressed?
Oh my gosh, did I skip over it? Let me see.
Yeah, I was interested in that. It says, if there's time during the discussion, I'd love to hear more about nitrous oxide. It does seem overlooked. This came from Diana Bray. Thank you. It does seem overlooked as compared to CO2 and methane. And as you said, why is that? I guess I have an interest in the weight of all of those in commercial livestock production. So if you could kind of address that, if there's time. Do you see that question, Crystal? It's higher up from Diana Bray.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if there's time during the discussion, I'd love to hear, more about nitrous oxide. Yeah, do you have any comments on that? Nitrous oxide, it does seem overlooked as compared to methane, as you said. Why is that?
And CO2, could you just kind of comment on the three?
Right. So as for why nitrous oxide doesn't seem to get talked about that much, I don't know. Yeah, I really don't have a good answer to that. It's just something that keeps striking me.
Well, it comes from a lot of other pollution sources, and I wonder if those are considered the dominant sources, like diesel gas and stuff. So it may be that it's less of a source, so the others are more important to reduce emissions. I don't know. That's my guess.
Yeah, you're right that it comes from industrial sources as well. I just feel like even that is not really addressed that much. You hear about the CO2, fossil fuels, transportation, and cow burps.
No, it isn't being addressed adequately, but and airplanes is coming from there. But I just wonder if that's a reason.
Yeah, maybe you're right. I'm not sure. And was the other question like the relative proportions of each one? Something like that. So let's see, what do we have here? So let's just look at this beef diagram. So here we have enteric fermentation, that's giving us a lot of CH4, and manure management here, also methane. So we've got this small-ish but not negligible sliver of nitrous oxide from manure management. And then, yeah, fairly large chunk of N2O here. So we're looking at, what's that, just over a third of the pie chart being nitrous oxide. I mean, that's large. So maybe that gets to the question about relative amounts of each one in the beef supply chain.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to capture this.
Yeah, it's actually in this FAO report that you might like, Gerber or Gerber et al., Tackling Climate Change Through Livestock.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, really fascinating information. Yeah, and Heidi says, I believe ag is the biggest source of nitrous oxide. I know X, but that includes other forms of ag, from tilling. No-till systems help reduce. Is that how do you say like NOx? Is it nitric oxide?
I'm sorry, bad
Yeah.
meme. Yeah, it's just a shorthand for nitrous oxides. Yeah.
Nitric oxide. Cool. Well, this was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Rachel. This is exactly the stuff I've been wanting to talk about and wanting to share with the veterinary community. And if you all know of anybody else who would want to present continuing education talks to us, please have them fill out this link to present. It's ouronor.org/conted. And Heidi, maybe you might be interested in giving a presentation in the future. And also go to ouronor.org/vetce for our next talk, which I think is tomorrow with Jeremy Marchant, if I'm not mistaken. But and then we have Dr. Knight. Is there going to be our next one on vegan pet foods? So really exciting stuff coming up. So ouronor.org/vetce. And I'll end it there. Thank you all so much for coming. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.